Hello.
Hi there. Glad to be with you.
Thank you so much for coming. So I have to start this interview off right. I admire your soul and your integrity. We don't have that in Illinois politics as you are as honest as they come, from my view. There's no lying in you.
No, I have to be very careful to make sure that I am as accurate as I can be. I also, in general, don't give interviews that are exclusive or off. Where will do background. Normally, if I say it, I'm on record.
The universe knows that you and me are both good souls, so that's why they brought you to me.
That must be the reason.
I'm going to learn a lot from you. I'll tell you that right now. And hopefully, other politicians and people who are running for office will learn as well. So I think we have a lot to go over, or at the very least, a few. And I wanted your thoughts on this. Most of the time, I don't ask people for their opinion because whatever I think, I just run with it. I tend to listen if they want to talk, but it's really rare when if I ask someone their opinion because I want to see if I'm right. In the city of Chicago and in the state of Illinois, we are known to be corrupt. We are known to have corruption. I believe, in my very strong personal opinion, there are at least four dominoes that create that. Probably more dominoes, but there's four dominoes that has the effect. One of the dominoes that is very popular is the average person will say, well, this politician did this because he or she is greedy. It's greed, which I agree. It is greed. But I keep going because I want to get to the root. I want to know what is in that root. The next domino after greed that is beyond extremely very important to me is insecurities. I think a lot of politicians are beyond insecure with themselves and who they are. So they believe by having money and getting extra money to do whatever is a temporarily fix to their insecurities. The third domino, and I really want to be respectful when I say this to you because I want your honest opinion. When I say this, everyone laughs. They just go into this field and they just start laughing. But I'm being serious. The third domino is I believe they're greedy because they're insecure, and they're insecure because they're not really good looking people. And there is that saying that ugly people tend to do ugly things, good looking people tend to do good looking things. I think the only good looking politicians that we have ever had that were major, JF Kennedy was a very good looking man and he did good things. Bill Clinton during the prime in the 90s, I don't think he was ugly. I think he was good looking and he wasn't as corrupt, at least not back then. The fourth domino, which is my personal favorite and my last domino, angel and demons, good versus evil. Do you believe that we have angels and demons? Like, are we stuck with demons somehow, some way?
Well, so let's go back through
The
all
first
that you've said.
domino.
Well,
Okay.
even before that, yes, we are corrupt. Um, Chicago is the most corrupt metropolitan region in the United States. And Illinois is the third most corrupt state. That's in terms of federal convictions in court since 1976. We've had 2,100, now it's getting larger each month, 2,100 public officials go to federal prison from Illinois for corruption since 76. We've had more than 1,800 in the metropolitan region, which includes things like the city council. 37 aldermen have currently gone to jail. Several are pending in cases now. Um, The suburbs, we found more than 60 suburbs in the region that had more than 200 corrupt officials, and that's gone up since that study, which is a decade old now. Operation Greylord, we found it in the courts, and so on and so forth, in nearly all the branches of government and public positions of authority and power. So your first conclusion that there's corruption in Chicago and Illinois is absolutely true, and it's based on evidence related to the federal convictions, but also a wealth of evidence in the testimonies that came out in the court decisions and in the exposés in the news media. So your first premise or domino is that it is because of greed and ambition. That is true. It's also partly true that it's because they have a sense of insecurity. Everyone in politics, good guys, bad guys, good women, bad women, are partly there because of a need for approval. And so you give a speech before a big crowd and everybody's applauding. You have the opportunity to be on television in prime time in the evening. There are all sorts of ways of being gratified. Most of them are legal and proper. One of the problems with that greed and ambition, though, is often they decide to run for higher office. And the cost of running for higher office is very prohibitive. It's $250,000 to run for alderman. On average, it's as much as $5 or $10 million to run for Congress, depending on which district you're running in. It's $10 million or more to run for mayor and so forth. At the gubernatorial level, it used to be $20 million. It's now been out of sight because of wealthy millionaires running for the office. So yes, there is an insecurity, and there is a greed and ambition, which are somewhat different. Is it because they're good looking or bad looking? I don't think so.
Really?
Yeah, because most of the politicians, at least the politicians that get very far in office, are, as you describe them, good looking, at least relative to the average American, say. And
Which politicians are these? The good-looking ones, besides JF Kennedy and
well,
Bill
even
Clinton.
ones like Harold Washington, ones
Yeah, he wasn't. Yeah, he was good-looking. He got women.
Brandon Johnson. I mean, there's a large number of aldermen.
Brandon Johnson got a cool style with his hair
Yeah,
that I always like. Every time he talks, I just focus on his hair. He has a style
yeah.
from like the '90s. Yeah. So yeah, all right, he's good-looking.
And so on. Not every politician is necessarily. Pritzker tends to be overweight, for instance, and so forth. But I don't think there's a general.
His money makes him good-looking,
Yeah,
though.
I don't think there's a general pattern of good look. For most politicians, being at least acceptably decent looking or good looking is a prerequisite of success, because they're exposed to a lot of media, they're exposed before audiences. And I forgot now your fourth domino.
And this is probably number one, but I wanted to save it for the last for the build-up. On planet Earth, I think we described all the first three dominoes.
Angels and demons. Yes, even if you don't believe in supernatural angels and demons, yes, every person has essentially angels and demons psychology-wise inside. They're tempted by urges that are demonic or bad, and they're also upheld by good, desires to do good. Most politicians desire to do good. They fall because the money is too great. They have to raise too much money for the next election, even if they don't want it as personal wealth. It is, and if you read anyone who is honest in writing a biography, they will talk about the angels and demons, or the good urges and bad urges, and how they had to struggle to overcome them. For instance, I'm reading a biography, the newest one, of Martin Luther King currently, who was a great American, but he had his demons. and the book spells out in detail his demons.
He had his demons. What? Yeah, I didn't read his book,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
so there, it's not
I'm more.
his.
I love Dr. King. I really do.
Yeah,
What he did was beyond amazing, and he made history. Malcolm X is my. I tend to get from a lot of my friends and close ones, and it's not nowhere near his status, but my friends tell me if there is a version of Malcolm X in 2023, you would be the closest one.
uh, I've not had that honor before.
Malcolm X, so obviously Dr. King created the civil
Right.
rights movement. We all know that. Malcolm X was outspoken and he did not kiss ass at all. He directly said it
And
the way it was.
in addition, he was willing to change his mind. He and King became much closer in ideology at just before Malcolm X was assassinated. It was one of the reasons he was assassinated.
Yeah, I say to my friend because my friends they love Dr. King. Some of them love Malcolm X. So I like to get their opinions. But if I had to do it all over again, Dr. King and Malcolm X both got assassinated. So I might as well live like Malcolm X, free, wild, piss a lot of people off. I'm gonna die anyway.
Not everyone who has been a public figure has died. There have been unfortunate assassinations like John F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. But most public officials have not been assassinated. There is a very bad trend at the moment, which some of my colleagues are studying, which is the level of threat and violence against all public officials has become astronomical. Um, I had death threats early when I was alderman, but I didn't have them continuously. Um,
You did?
sure, everyone who is in the public eye gets some of them. Um, but it is more common these days, both to have threats and to have some action, like, it can be as minor as throwing eggs at a public official or whatever. But the verbal threats are quite out of hand, and um, they're really unacceptable in our democracy.
Right. Before we get off the topic, or the next topic, the angels and demons. If you don't mind me asking, when your time is up and when my time is up, where do you think we go? Hell, heaven, be judged, reincarnated, nothing, meet our loved ones, meet our grandma, mom, dad?
I don't think it's the meet and greet situation, but I do think that the soul is preserved. Um, and in some sense, how much torment or bliss there is depends on the actions. In that sense, there's karma.
Yeah. Do you think that you and me did something in our previous life or wherever we were to wind up here in Chicago?
No,
No.
no. I understand the theory of reincarnation. I've studied Eastern religions. There may be some sense of a permanence, but I don't think our lives are dictated by previous lives.
Not at all.
No.
Okay. I asked you that question, and again, I emphasize you're very well spoken. When you speak, there's a calmness to you in all the previous interviews I saw watching you. When I speak, I tend to have somewhat of your calmness, but if things don't go my way, I tend to scream and get mad.
Yeah, I have to be pretty severely provoked for that to happen. Um, part of it's being a public official, and before that, I was in the civil rights movement and I led political organizations before I got elected, but particularly as a public official. You learn that people you disagree with may hold valid positions. At least it's their right to have them. And so you learn in general at least a tolerance of the fact that people have a different position. You also learn, if you're smart, that you're not always right on every question.
Right, right. Um, is it safe to say that the average alderman and politician does not have their PhD like you do?
Yes, there have been relatively few, for instance, college professors. Um, the only other two I remember are Charles Merriam at the turn of the 20th century and Paul Douglas in 1930s. Um, so it's pretty rare to have a professor as an alderman. However, the vast majority of aldermen do have a law degree, which is an advanced degree, and it does take serious study. It's just a little more narrow or specific.
Yeah. I did some minor research on you. Of course, I already naturally knew who you were growing up. It said that you had a PhD, and I already knew you were a professor. And I asked myself, this guy has a PhD. He could teach anywhere he practically wants to in America or the world. Why would he want to get involved in Chicago politics?
Well, let's go back to where I teach, or I taught at UIC for 55 years. Um, I was in Africa working on my dissertation, which is a study of two towns in Sierra Leone.
I saw that.
And while I was there, the only method of communication we had at that point, other than an occasional letter by airmail, was Time and Newsweek. But in any case, Time and Newsweek and those kinds of magazines were saying that the cities were erupting in flames. This was late '66 and late and early '67. Um, and I wrote my dissertation advisor back at Indiana University and said, here's a list of cities. I understand there are a lot of problems. I would like to have a job in one of them. I came back and I was writing my dissertation. I had, he helped me get a job interview at the University of Illinois at Chicago, which was at that time interested in someone who could do both American government and African politics. And so I did one job interview and took the job and was there 55 years. So that's how I got to Chicago. I'd visited Chicago once or twice with friends before, but I didn't even know that Daley ran a Boss machine when I moved here. I just knew that Chicago was an urban city with a lot of problems and maybe I could contribute to solving some of them. So that's how I got to Chicago. I got into politics, and I'd been in student politics, but I got into adult politics because we were in the middle of the war in Vietnam and we still had segregation and discrimination, and I'd been in the civil rights movement. So I was concerned. I was also concerned with what was then called the imperial presidency, too much power in the executive branch. And Eugene McCarthy became the candidate who spoke to all three issues. And I attended a third party convention at which he spoke. The third party idea didn't work. He then ran in the Democratic Party. And I became campaign manager in the 9th Congressional District at the time on the north side of Chicago, essentially from the 42nd Ward to the 50th Ward. And we lost pretty badly. We got about 20% of the vote for our delegates to support McCarthy at the Democratic National Convention. I did see the demonstrations in 1968, tried to participate in some. I participated in a walk across Chicago from Grant Park to the convention center. And at that point, I decided, well, our idea of electing a president and working our way down was probably not a good idea, that we needed to work from the bottom up. And so I created a group called the Independent Precinct Organization on the north side of Chicago. Before its creation in 1969, not a single public official other than some Republicans, there had been no independent or independent Democrat win a position like alderman or ward committeeman. Afterwards, we elected a whole stream, more than 20 candidates, people like Don Clark Netsch in the Constitutional Convention, or Bernie Weisberg, Bill Singer, and myself, and then later Marty Overman and others as aldermen. And we permanently changed the political history of Chicago by reorienting it so that independent voice meant something. We would probably call those people, we later called ourselves reformers, or always did. Today we'd be called progressives.
Wow. So you have lived and are still living an interesting life. You have been around the block for decades, and I believe you've seen a lot from Old Man Daly to Richard Daly. What do you make? What do you make of all this? Do you feel that mentally you're in some type of war, you're in some type of fight, you're in some type of trial from the universe, or do you feel, because I feel you're a fighter. You're an activist. You're a lot of things. You're like me. You don't just have one title. You have a numerous amount of things that you do. Um, you fight the good fight, and you've been doing that for decades, and I've been doing that too the last probably 15 years for other reasons. And I'm just mentally, like, I'm not gonna lie, I'm just mentally stressed. I'm angry. Sometimes depressed on what goes on in Chicago, the killings, the 7-year-old girl dying through the McDonald's drive-through, the Chicago police officer getting shot at the Thompson Center, and much more. That's starting to have a major toll on me where I'm just ready to, I want to leave. I want to go to the suburbs. This is not for me anymore.
So there are a couple of different questions involved or topics involved in what you said. First of all, let's take the overarching pattern. Yes, I did lead the opposition bloc in the city council against Richard J. Daley. And so I've seen whatever it is, 7 mayors now. I've been on the transition teams for 3 or 4 of them. And I've written about the city council and corruption, Chicago politics, in multiple books and articles. But we've got a new book coming out in January called Modern Mayors of Chicago, from Harold Washington to Lori Lightfoot. And to make it really simple, what we found, and we have multiple authors covering the different mayors, is an arc going from Harold Washington to Lori Lightfoot and now to Brandon Johnson. And it's an arc of progressive politics. And I could go into a lot of details about what each mayor did and why we conclude that. But in general, it's a more positive arc than is usually recognized. And even the mayors in between, like Richard M. Daley and Rahm Emanuel, contributed to making Chicago a global city and did things like Millennium Park that were on the whole positive for Chicagoans, even if I don't like all of their policies about everything. But yes, it is very easy to get overwhelmed by the problems of Chicago. In my new book called Democracy's Rebirth, which is a view from Chicago, I list some 28 reforms that ought to be made. And what I urge the readers, and what I urge when I talk to people about that particular book, is that you can't work on all 28. Pick one that you care about. Could be corruption, it could be campaign finance reform, which is very important. It could be a minor thing, structural problem like the Electoral College and so forth. Yes, you could vote or support all of these things, but the issue primarily is pick one and work on that, or pick a couple. The other thing is there is an overriding issue beyond any of the specifics, and that's to reestablish democracy itself, or to make democracy work. And that has 2 parts. One, our representative democracy isn't working very well. Witness the collapse of the Congress, the near crisis we've had over both the debt crisis and the budget crisis, a standstill, sometimes called gridlock. So the first thing we need is to fix the representative democracy. And a congressman has to represent 780,000 people, which is basically impossible. You have to represent their views and their interests, and a congressman can't even know what they are.
Of course.
But we've developed as political scientists a system that would help inform both the congressman and the constituents. And that is taking a sample of 100 people in their district that are voters and having a 35-minute internet conversation with a congressman around one issue, say immigration. And that allows the citizen to understand how difficult it is to figure out a governmental solution, particularly one that can get passed. And secondly, it allows the congressman to know, well, most people are sympathetic about the problem of immigration, but they want to protect their jobs, or they want, the complications you can get into discussing a topic like that. And that would make our democracy more deliberative, but even that wouldn't be enough. We need to create participatory democracy. And in Chicago, we have only one tool of participatory democracy at the moment, and that's what's called the participatory budgeting process, which is used in only 8 wards. And it covers the $1.5 million in the aldermanic menu. Every alderman gets to give the city a list of projects that need to be infrastructure projects in their ward. Instead of the aldermen deciding by themselves, 8 of the aldermen have chosen to have the community come together and pick projects, describe them, figure out what they cost from the experts at City Hall, and then have a vote at a school on a weekend, and more than 1,000 people participate in each of these wards. And they make the choice that, yes, we want to fix a street, or like in the 49th ward, they want a public mural along the Metro tax, or whatever the problem may be.
It's interesting you bring that up because I was just talking about that the last 3 months. They're starting to have these town hall meetings, and in my opinion, and this is just my thinking, every meeting that I ever had with any politician or any public figure, and I'm not going to mention their names because they were nice to me. They took the time out, and I understand it's not up to that one politician. It's not up to that one political figure. There's always someone, like you mentioned, you have to have them all vote on it, and it almost seems like it's just one big scheme. But I was mentioning the town hall meetings these days that they're having. There's never no follow-up afterwards. There's never no, all right, remember that meeting that we had last week where I took the time out and I drove there and I sat there, my staff organized it, and the people actually came? What came about from that meeting?
Well,
And no one could ever answer my question afterwards. It's just became into a shouting match.
yeah, that often happens. What we did in the 44th ward when I was alderman is we actually created neighborhood government beyond participatory budgeting. And how we did that is we created a ward assembly, which had 2 elected representatives from each precinct in the ward. There were 64 at the time, and 1 representative from every legitimate community organization, including street gangs. I mean, we weren't meaning legitimate that way, but they actually were an organization and existed like a block club or a community group like Lakeview Neighbors. So we met once a month, and by their vote, they controlled my vote in the city council and the legislation I introduced. The only exception was if they came out with a position that was contrary to human rights, I would reserve the option of not following them on that. We created a community zoning board, held hearings in the neighborhood in the evening. We created a traffic review commission, and we even created Asamblea Abierta, which was the Spanish-speaking assembly, because we had a large number of Latinos and they couldn't really participate effectively in the ward assembly, so we created a separate Spanish-speaking
So you got
assembly.
things done in your time.
Yes.
Remember?
Well, I've lost a lot of votes. Reform sometimes takes a long time. What would happen is Linda Prey or I or Bill Singer would introduce a perfectly sensible piece of legislation to do something. It would be voted down, and then they would get into a budget crisis or a problem, and they'd go pull our legislation and be reintroduced as Mayor Richard J. Daley's legislation to do X or Y. So we got a lot of things done, but they weren't the simple way you usually think about in a textbook explanation of how a bill becomes a law. In fact, Paul Douglas was alderman in 1939, and he looked at the bridge tenders and opening the Chicago bridges over the river. There are 29 bridges, and they had from 2 to 6 bridge tender, actually 4 to 6 on every bridge. It was open, they were there 24 hours a day. It was a couple of hundred bridge tenders. Nice job, because in the middle of winter, you don't open any bridges. The river's frozen. There's no traffic on the river. Even in the summer, there isn't a boat that requires a bridge opening every few minutes. It's fairly rare. So Paul Douglas said, the simplest way we could cut down the number of bridge tenders is we could have them be mobile. They would open a bridge, say at Michigan Avenue, and they'd get in their car and drive down to LaSalle and open that bridge.
Creative.
And it cut by a third all of the bridge tenders. Now, the problem was, of course, the bridge tenders were party precinct workers for Daley. In Douglas's time, they were for Kelly. So it was voted down in 1939. It took until Harold Washington in 1983 to adopt it. Sometimes it can take decades, but you do get it adopted because good ideas have a life of their own, particularly if they make sense and if eventually public support is there.
You think America was better back in the good old days, such as
The Civil War, segregation in the South? No, I
no,
don't
not those days.
think. Well, which days?
60s and the 70s. My uncle always says, my generation is one of the dumbest generations, and you have no idea how America was in the 60s and the 70s, such as when you go to the grocery store, you pay less and your grocery cart is filled. Now you go to the grocery store and you pay more and your grocery cart is less.
We have had inflation, if that's
Mhm.
the only thing he's talking about. But
Oh no, he's talking about more.
yeah, on the more, he's mostly wrong.
How about the morals? Like, remember Mr. Rogers?
Yeah, I remember Mr. Rogers. And
Remember when Mr. Rogers went to Congress? And I watch that all the time. I love it. It gives
yeah,
me hope. Congress, they genuinely paid attention to him. They genuinely were listening. They were asking him, can you show us a demonstration? They really cared and they listened. Now, Congress, you see them on their phone. You see them, they're just there to there. And it's just a different time from the Americans and Congress during Mr. Rogers' days till now.
well, I think you have to be fairly careful to distinguish between Congress people. Jan Schakowsky on the north side, or um, I think Chuy Garcia, though he works primarily on the immigration issues. I can name a dozen really outstanding congressmen who take their role in legislating seriously.
Okay.
And so, and that's just out of Illinois. Across the country, there are hundreds. Now, there are some bad actors in Congress, as there is in every institution. And there are people who are so ideologically driven that they're blind and aren't really representing America, but their fictional belief of what America could be. Maybe what they think it was like in the 1700s or in the 1960s.
Do you think the music was better in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s versus now?
I tend to like that, but then I'm old.
The Yeah, okay. Well, you said that. The I think you're wise. I think you have experience. The recording of music, such as that machine,
Oh, it's fabulous what you can do now.
the tape, but now people are recording on a computer program and it sounds like a cheap plastic because your vocal isn't digital. If I was AI, I go to an AI domain. My voice is analog, so it goes in the tape and it brings out these harmonics. And that's one reason why the Beatles hit, Aerosmith, Bon Jovi, the old Dr. Dre, Nirvana.
Yeah, I think you're quite, I mean, they used to have multiple tracks also, and many times they're shoddy into only a track or two.
Yeah.
Um, but the technology is there to make fabulous music and fabulous recordings. The tunes themselves are what I play the piano, and I'm more interested in the music itself
Mm-hmm. You have a
because I
grand
play it.
piano?
Well, I used to. I have now a keyboard.
Yeah.
Um, I frequently play on a grand piano when I take lessons at Old Town School. But the keyboard is fabulous because with the keyboard, I can play a piece and on, say, the regular piano setting. But I might play it on the violins or the strings, and it sounds very different. And then I'll remember, internalize how it sounded, usually slower and clearer, and take that back to the piano, and I play better on the piano because of it.
Yeah. The movies and the TV, I definitely believe that has improved from the 4K,
Mm-hmm.
or I should say from the antenna days with the rabbit ears
Oh, yes.
and tuning in. Now 4K has came and making movies almost it's became a humongously lot easier for filmmakers to editors. So that I definitely appreciate it. I love Google. I'm in love with Google.
Mm-hmm.
I do not like Facebook. I'm not into Twitter, but Google teaches.
Oh, I was surprised on the book I'm working on currently, which is called Dreamers of Chicago. I'm sorry, Dreaming Chicago's Future. And I trace everyone from Daniel Burnham to academics to Jane Addams at Hull House and so forth. Well, they're before even my time. So I have to rely, I rely on books like Encyclopedia of Chicago, which is also digitalized and available in a digital format. So I have a lot of books at hand, but I also use Google to look up facts because I need to make it accurate and I need to ground it in fact. And so Google is a blessing because it'll lead me to 20 different choices about Jane Addams. And I can add to what I already know from 20 years at Hull House, which is her book, to all these other aspects about Hull House.
Yeah.
And I can copy over the actual maps that they produced at Hull House to illustrate for the reader what they did when they did a very different thing than Daniel Burnham, who had these grand boulevards and stuff. The Jane Addams folks went house to house and recorded the ethnicity, the income, whether or not they had a functioning toilet indoors or whether they had an outhouse in the back, everything like that. And then they would come up with plans to fix some of those problems, sanitation problems. She later became the sanitation official for her ward, and so on and so forth. So Google can help. It can't really initiate the idea very well. You really have to have an idea and be looking to get more information, is where Google is a wonderful instrument.
When I was in high school and in grammar school, I wish nothing more that I knew Google was coming, because my teachers would always get mad because I wouldn't pay attention to them. And I so would have used the argument, I don't need to learn from you or learn how to spell. Google's about to come up, so Google will fix my correct in grammar spelling, which it has dramatically. So I love
Yes, but
Google.
it still makes, you don't need necessarily use Google if for instance, if you're doing Word or to do your writing,
That too.
it will suggest corrections,
Yeah.
but they aren't always right. So
They're
you have
not.
to, no,
See, I wouldn't know that.
yeah. So if you're actually paying attention, 'cause
Wording, really?
you
Oh
have to make
boy.
sure, often it makes very good suggestions.
Wonder why Pritzker didn't get back to me. I spelled it wrong.
There you go.
All right. So you brought up Richard Daley a few times.
Mm-hmm.
I lived in Bridgeport.
Mm-hmm.
I left at 7th grade
Mm-hmm.
around, and I used to walk by his house every day.
Sure.
Police out there in
Mm-hmm.
the front and in the back. Um, Obviously, I wasn't involved with politics at that age. I just knew I lived 3 blocks away
Where
from
the
the
mayor
mayor.
did. Yeah.
That's all I knew.
Yep.
Moment of truth. In my opinion, Richard Daley did some good things, but he also did some terribly bad things.
That's correct.
So I'm a positive person and I just want to focus on the good things. He did take care of Bridgeport. He did take care of the people there. It was cleaner at the time. Kids were able to ride their bicycles at 11 o'clock at nighttime. He took care of the Chicago police, or at the very least, cops weren't dying. And that's just a good thing. I don't like to see anyone die, but he did take care of that aspect of it, in my opinion, from what I witnessed.
Well, he deserves some credit for other things, and I did oppose him and led the opposition bloc. But um, if you go back to when he started as mayor in 1955, yes, Daley did a number of good things. When he became mayor in 1955, the city council was run by the Council of Grey Wolves, which means the corrupt aldermen of the time. They would meet in the back room as part of the finance committee and decide the city budget. That is, the departments could suggest, I want $500,000, but the aldermen would decide whether they got $500,000. So there wasn't an executive budget like we're used to, or like the president would produce to Congress. Daley, following after the Home Rule Commission of '54, was able to get state legislation that gave him the power to introduce the budget. And that was a good enhancement of executive authority and took away some of the corruption that happened in the city council. More importantly, we came out of World War II as a time of affluence. There was a lot of housing built. The veterans were able to go to college. There were a lot of good things happening. It was a time of affluence, to use the phrase of that time. But we began to fall into decay as a city. And what Daley did was to rebuild the loop. He brought in new office buildings. He got people like Arthur Rubloff to build significant high-rise housing. There was a growth of population. We grew to 3.6 million people. We're now at 2.7 million people in Chicago. And so he deserves credit for that. But he also deserves the blame for continuing segregation, for developing CHA housing in the worst possible way,
I know.
and so forth. And of course, he abetted the corruption on the part of the aldermen. He sponsored nepotism, including jobs for his sons and
Right.
positions.
Let's talk about that. So now to the bad side of the Daley. The Robert Taylor homes, Cabrini Green, the Dearborns, the Ickes, Stateway Gardens, Wentworth Roadhouses. I believe he did keep all of them together, and they ended up doing some bad things to each other, and I don't think Daley cared about that. But
Well, it's a little worse than that. Let me tell you what happened.
okay,
So the CHA was headed by some fairly what we would call progressive administrators, and they plotted a program to develop essentially scattered site housing throughout the city. The ward committeemen, the white ward committeemen, who were by far the dominant in the city council, had no part of that. They said none of these in our ward. And so they forced CHA, if it was going to build housing, to build these high rises like Robert Taylor homes. And Daley didn't want to go against them. Daley had originally been elected by the black vote, really. He had divided the white vote. He would have lost the election without the black vote. And the black vote was what brought him to power, but he turned his back on the blacks.
black people voted for him?
Yes, in large numbers at that time in 1955.
Why?
Well, partly because they thought he would allow some programs like the policy racket that ran. He was supported by William Dawson, the most powerful congressman who ruled the South Side. And there were things like that that caused them to think, well, Daley will be okay for us. Remember, this was a segregated time to begin with.
Yeah, they were let down, huh?
They were very let down and began to vote with their feet. And so by 1963, the black vote was dwindling. It still tended to be a majority for Daley. And as the years went on, Daley got less and less of the African American vote and was challenged by people like Harold Washington, Bill Singer, a number of different people who would have been much more progressive than Richard J. Daley was. So Daley was complicit with working with the white ward committeemen to structure the machine so that the white ethnic vote would keep him in power.
Wow, yeah, I did not know that. I think the number one bad thing that Daley did, and I don't even know how he legally got away with this. Morally, it's just beyond disgusting. So, I don't believe that we should pay for parking, but if we are going to pay to park in the land of the free, that money should go to the teachers, the kids, lunches, the Chicago police, safety. It comes back to us.
So you're conflating the two Dailies. Richard J. Daley did put in parking meters, but it was
Right,
Richard M. Daley who
right.
sold off the parking meters.
Yeah,
So it's Richard M. Daley, not Richard J. Daley. That
correct. Yeah, it's definitely Richard M. Daley. Yeah, I didn't live by the J1, I lived by the M1.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, Richard Daley, M. Daley, he sold the parking meters to some investment company in California. So now when we pay to park, that money goes to a private company. And I don't know how that is legal by any means.
Well, it is. The first thing they did was sell off the Skyway, or give a 99-year lease,
Hmm.
to be accurate, for the Skyway. And that was so profitable, the city began to run into financial difficulties under Richard M. Daley. And he didn't want to raise property taxes, as his father had not wanted to raise property taxes either. So what he did was sort of one-time infusions of money. Now, the idea was that we would lease the operation of the parking meters to a consortium, and they would derive the profits. We would derive the profits from any ticketing or the rest for not parking correctly. Um, and that was supposed to last. I mean, the lease lasts for 75 years. That was supposed to last and be slowly used for the government functions you're suggesting. The problem was by the second year of the lease, we essentially used all the money as a stopgap measure so not to raise property taxes.
Okay, so I agree and I could see his point. And I thank him for that. No one wants property taxes raised. That's fine. So his argument is I didn't want to raise property taxes, so this private investment in California is receiving billions of dollars.
Yes, and the same was true for the Skyway, the
Okay,
leasing of
all
the
right.
Skyway.
Michael Mannigan,
Yes.
the Mannigan family. What do you make of that?
Well, I assume Michael Madigan will be convicted of corrupt dealings, violating federal law. Um, Probably the scandals are so complicated we don't need to go into them all, but he's going to be tried this coming spring. His colleagues, all of whom are related to the Madigan operation, were all convicted along with Commonwealth Edison Company in a trial this last summer. And so it's pretty clear that the U.S. attorney will use essentially the same information and a little more to convict Mike Madigan come spring. He was a powerful figure. He dominated not only the state legislature, he was the longest serving Speaker of the House of Representatives in the or General Assembly and the state legislature of anyone in the United States, not just
Hmm.
Illinois. And he also became head of the Illinois Democratic Party and therefore had a lot of control over who was endorsed and who got money and who got campaign workers. So, from being the most powerful man in the state, or maybe second most if the governor is considered most, um, he has been reduced to being on trial, and I think will be convicted.
Wow. So I don't like the Mannigans.
Hmm.
I don't think the average person likes the Mannigans unless they think they can get something from him. After I'm done being mad and angry, at the end of the day, believe it or not, I don't want to see him die in prison because that's more than likely what will happen. And my uncle, who is your age, he says you don't want to go to prison, but the worst time to go to prison is when you are old because it starts screwing with your head. And I heard Ed Ferdoliak was in solitary confinement freaking out because he just couldn't handle those walls.
It is a very severe punishment, and it is more difficult for people that have any underlying health problems. And so I would prefer not to see him die in prison, but I do think he should be sentenced to prison for his crimes, which I view as very great.
Yeah. Another thing with Madigan, and I just still can't, from this day, comprehend, and it just is a never-ending cycle. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of people who worship Madigan, kiss Madigan's ass, tried to be in with him in any sort of way, and now that he's indicted, all those people have vanished, and I just wonder if I'm Madigan sitting at home, you disloyal, you used me the same way I used the people's money. Do those lights, do you think those lights ever go on? Because there's a lot of people, and I could name them. They got campaign donations from
Oh,
him,
most political candidates that were in tight races, if it was a state race, got money from the Madigan operation.
and they're all
But
quiet now.
and there's all of the ones who were his precinct captains who still have their job at City Hall or the equivalent. And he provided a lot of services to the constituents. Um, Not all of them have turned their back on him, but yes, many people are being very quiet.
Yeah, and I don't know, like, I couldn't go to sleep at nighttime knowing, but that's just me, though. I'm a very different person. The other thing that I can comprehend is how in the heck can Michael Mannigan and Edward Burke have a day job in the government as two powerful positions and also have a private law firm running at the same time during the day? How do all three of those, how is that
Well,
legal? Like, if we
that's
stop that, I think we could come close
yes.
to stopping corruption.
Well, probably not, but it is a major loophole. The problem isn't that Madigan and Burke have private law firms. It's that their private law firms are for property tax appeals.
Right.
And because of their clout, they nearly always win when they show up before the Board of Appeals, and sometimes they before judges that they help nominate and get selected as judge. So that they're using their clout as the Speaker of the House or the Finance Committee Chair of the City Council to bring private benefit. That is, they're both millionaires, and they're millionaires because they represent the large corporations, American Airlines, Trump Tower, and
Right.
so forth.
I just don't know how that's legal to do, though. Like, if
It's
I'm,
legal because
it's
so
legal
the
because they say it's legal.
well, so yes, they can have a law firm. Their particular law practice leads into these two corruption trials that are coming up: Burke's in November 6th and Madigan's in spring. Um, One of the problems is the Supreme Court, in their latest decisions, have defined corruption very, very narrowly. Essentially, I have to give you a bribe for a specific vote or action you're going to take as a government official. Like I give you like for aldermen, you give them an envelope for $500 to fix a drunk driving ticket. It has to be a specific action, a very specific quid pro quo. That is absolutely absurd. It's a wrong ruling by the Supreme Court. It started with Citizens United and got only worse with the later decisions. And Congress needs to pass laws that change that
Yeah.
because it's not likely the Supreme Court is going to change its position.
Two last questions before I let you go. What do you think about Governor J.B. Pritzker?
I think Pritzker's done a very good job. I've not always been a fan of his. I supported, for instance, Jan Schakowsky when she ran for Congress and Pritzker was the opponent. Um, but Pritzker has done a great job with the economy of the state and with gaining national prominence.
Yeah.
And a lot of social programs that have been very important. So I rate Pritzker as a governor quite highly.
Yeah. He's different in a good way.
Yes.
He's not like any other governor that we had before. So the more I see him, I mean, there are a couple things that I disagree, but no one's going to be perfect. In this generation, you either love this politician or you hate this politician. And I'm, all right, this person has done some things that I didn't like, but he's done more good things. He's different. He's definitely different. My last question to you: do you believe that Republicans and Democrats in the majority of America, do you think that's a good cop, bad cop routine where they all secretly work together?
No,
You don't think it's to divide the country?
I think the problem is the polarization. The fact that there's lockstep voting in, say, the Congress, and no willingness to compromise and find a common ground. Um, the whole idea of deliberative democracy is we would have a discussion, as in the Constitutional Convention in 1789. And eventually we would find an alternative that neither of us was necessarily advocating to begin with, but it emerged because of this debate or discussion that occurred between us. That's why the word deliberative democracy or deliberation is important. Democracy is not just a knee-jerk vote, and whoever wins by one vote gets to be dictator.
We have more in common than we don't. And unfortunately, it doesn't play out that way. We're always fighting, we're always at each other's throats, we're always name calling. But if you think about it, we're all humans, we're all Americans, we all like good food, we all have families, we all like music, we all like nice cars, we just want the finer things in life. And I don't believe in the whole dividing thing. I don't believe in the Democrat, the Republican, the liberal. I believe in what's your name. I believe in you want a beer. I believe in you want a cigarette. I believe in, what do you do? Like for fun. That's just me though, and most we don't talk about that. I think we all want nice houses. I think we all want swimming pools, and we all like girls, or some of us guys, which is fine. I mean, I don't care, but we don't focus on all that good stuff like steak and McDonald's and Big Mac.
So you are quite correct. There is more that should be in common than divides us. There are still some great evils in society. The leftovers of segregation, now discrimination are one of them, to give an example. There is corruption, and there's more we could do to root out corruption and so forth. I'll make a fairly long list, but there is more that we share in common, and if we have a common goal of doing what's best for the country or the city or the state, that would improve, and we need to ratchet up the level of tolerance. And one of the problems is, I used to joke with my class and some of my constituents, we say we're a democracy, why don't we actually try it and see if it works? Because we haven't.
Yeah. Thank you so much
My
for coming
pleasure.
over. It was an honor to meet you. You are a legend. You have been through a lot. I wish you nothing but the best on your new journey. And before we leave, I'm going to get a camera shot of your new book that you brought
Okay.
in and everything else. But I do sincerely thank you for coming over and educating a lot of us and getting your opinions. Are you out of politics?
Well, I'm not running for public office. I support a lot of candidates financially and with advice. I, for instance, helped fundraise for Lori Lightfoot's election, both her first and second,
Oh,
and the time she
really?
ran again. So I'm still active like that in politics. I certainly advocate for legislation and programs,
You
and
like
I
Lori
vote.
Lightfoot?
I did,
You do?
yes, yeah.
All right.
I think she did a number of good things for the city.
Really?
Yeah.
What did she do?
Well, Invest Southwest has been underappreciated because it takes a long time to get the projects to come in. She moved the affordable housing legislation. The first action she did in office was an executive order that we from the transition team had suggested, which eliminated aldermanic privilege and everything but zoning. And that
Yeah, right.
just there weren't the votes to do that at the time.
I have a good memory of Lori Lightfoot. I went to Dr. Martin Luther King's breakfast,
Hmm.
and she actually said hi to me.
Yeah.
She actually, cause she saw Operation
Yeah.
Chicago, so she probably saw, okay, Operation Chicago. That's people know of me. They rather everyone knows, like they know what Operation Chicago is.
Well, and in her case, she at a one-to-one level was like most
Yeah,
public figures, very accommodating and very outgoing.
yeah. I'm surprised I own the trademarks and the rights to Operation Chicago. I was surprised that's available. So
Hmm.
I'm grateful that she said hi to me, and I wish her the best. I think she inherited a lot of shit from obviously Chicago before.
Right.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.